Good. How many pounds did you gain?
Yes, this was your weight.
You didn't have this before. You're a good sport.
From stretch ingredients makes the sauce.
Isn't that awesome? And the guacamole probably right there too, right? Oh,
But this is viewing a possible mountain where they have a lighthouse. Nice. You're looking back over the city, but you can't see anywhere. That's so cool.
wow.
So it really was.
How'd you get around to a car or?
We had one. If I were to go back again, I wouldn't rent it.
I'm just gonna stay in one city.
They have these little jitney like things that can take over.
Right. Yeah, get it, right?
So this is most of what we were faced with. Those kind of clouds.
Yeah.
Like
Similar to-
everything else. But
Oh, yeah, you got that one. Nice. That was your Quest Star or just?
that was a little question.
Nice. Awesome. I love the clouds. They were beautiful. If they weren't there, you'd rather they weren't there, but.
Rather they weren't there. But yeah, I bought the Flash Star and I used to sell it.
Bruce, do you want to go first?
And I'm glad I didn't go to the work.
It's only 3 slides.
Wasn't the greatest
No,
tradition.
the Sea Star did well for me. I got similar photos to that,
Okay.
and so it was great, you know?
But Wyoming is definitely better.
The
The
clips.
visual experience.
It's great.
She said it's
Where,
so
remind me
much
where you were
fun.
again? Losing track.
We were
This time.
west of Ashton.
Ah, you said you were- Yeah.
Yeah, it was open to
Experience.
And we were in jacket.
I did see that, right?
Great.
Yeah, we had a great Sue Johnson and
Dark skies.
Nice.
And then Don
Road
Miller.
was unbelievable, moving, you know,
We
the
were
planets
here.
would pop right
I was
out.
watching the satellite. We took
We had no concerns of.
They
Go
drove
to
and
the
joined
peak
up,
where we
which
were.
made it even more fun. Those are like, they're like, those are not.
Oh, nice.
Nice.
Yeah, best.
They want to meet you, they want to know the news of the day.
But they get an airplane, they get home 2 a.m. So
Yeah.
it worked out really well. It was a must.
I thought about it a long hard, but the safety factor.
No, they,
Like,
I checked the last night, but even be cloudy.
I been through some friends of mine who were in Washington State. They were like in the Northwest.
Oh.
They got pictures that would put. They were just unbelievable, and they didn't even realize.
We didn't get.
And they took them with the cell.
I know my nephew in Minnesota. Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. it is.
Time versus law.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was, it was great. Great pictures.
And then again,
in Minnesota.
the Arizona side.
Everything looks like it's working. Yay.
Knock on something.
Yep.
It's a great time. So if you ever want to go to Mexico, that's a great place. to go.
Okay.
There's nothing crazy.
Heather?
This is very, very.
Good, good. Glad you did. Hey, look who's here in person.
Oh.
No disuse.
Did you see the comet at all from your angle, or was it just hidden in the clouds? It was there. You saw it? Okay.
Venus was not.
Yes. I did not see the.
How you doing, Pete?
I was there.
Oh, okay.
I was cloudy.
You were
just
not-
kind of stood around.
You were 90%, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, Pete, can you hear me?
It wasn't cloudy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, good. Just checking on you. Just checking on you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm still kicking.
Ready?
It was very.
I don't either.
I want to do this.
I know. Maybe I-
That's tough. That can be hit or miss.
And they're still
Wow.
bad, you know, like, you know, if any cat gets old and it's
Your father stop or anything? Right, yeah, but nothing happened.
I guess we're okay then.
Yeah. Which is compared to about 75.
That could be lucrative for you if you are. Yeah, I was on the other side, so with Pfizer, I actually, in one case, I led the acquisition. And it was interesting to see it because I did all the market analysis, the forecast. And, you know, then you deal with the company and what their forecasts were comparing, they're up here, you know, come on, let's be real.
This summer.
Yeah, it's true somewhere between the two of them, you know, but it's a challenge on both sides, but it's really worthwhile if you're on that company gets acquired. That's what you think.
Then it looks like he'll
Yeah.
sit up and.
I've been retired 11 years.
It's not bad.
Yeah. But, you know, as you get older, things are gonna happen, so you wonder why you're healthy, be able to do things in retirement.
So what do
Yeah, so don't wait too long. That's my only advice. Those are- How old are you now?
Not a.
Yeah.
No. It just, you know, I don't know, but nothing's bad.
Hybridized. There's a difference.
Yeah.
But all that's gonna be built in the next month, so,
Okay,
you know,
we'll see your face in a few months.
yeah, I'm either gonna be tired or I'm in a big year. Really are not supposed to, and I am.
If you're forced to retire and you're in a position financially to be able to do it, yeah.
Hey, Barb,
Yeah, no.
kitty on John's lap.
You're gonna be my mom.
Oh, okay.
That's John.
Wow.
Oh, God.
Just sleep. I'm like.
Which kitty is that, John? Which one?
That's, Carrington.
Just, I need sleep, unlike you.
Let's see.
Which one is that?
Now we got John.
You're muted.
Yeah.
You're muted. There you
It's Crystal,
go. Crystal, okay.
Crystal Carrington. So what could you see? Just her sleeping probably, yeah. And there she is.
We see that.
I'm busy typing, and trying to do two things at once. So
Okay. Multitask.
It's really novel in its approach.
It's raining here. Nasty. Ugly.
That are gonna have to.
yeah, I wanted to come down, but I have a slow leak in my front right tire. And I was like, you know, I don't think I want to drive far right now.
Not on a rainy night.
We're here in the rain, come
Walk in
on.
the tires.
No guts, no glory. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you guys are much gutsier than me. So.
Stop letting the air out of your tire.
Because you know what? I still have not gotten used to driving in Pennsylvania after 6.5 years down in Maryland. And these potholes, especially up in Schuylkill County, I'm convinced. I hit a pothole last week, and I'm convinced that's what caused it. So anyway, I'm gonna put myself on mute again because Jack is yelling in the background too.
There's.
Eat the rain. Yeah. Yeah, I saw the rain, I'm like, I have to go. So, well, we bless her. I'm good. You great? Oh, yeah. Cookies I made up here, I think I want.
Right.
Oh, you have to have it. Good. It's a secret ingredient. You don't want to know.
How's it feel to be out of Florida?
When did you get back?
Last Saturday. Yeah, we come back weekend before Mother's Day. That's not a reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's like a standard timing, you come back in time, I'll do it.
Right.
It's a lot of stuff.
When we go down after election day. Cause I go.
Yeah.
So in your house.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody wanted to use it. But we don't.
Yeah, yeah.
Great.
Oh, wow, okay, yeah.
Where is it in Florida? Kind of. We have been there twice with the kids, you know. Yeah. Okay.
You want to this thing?
Yeah, yeah.
Plus your ears looked a little funny.
You're right, Minnie. So what do you do, visit or did you?
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
I used to work on me.
Yeah. Instructions for them. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I know it.
Based on. It's, yeah,
Right.
this is regular sports.
Oh, yeah.
The guy tumbling down the other side, yeah.
But, it's where they bring teams down.
So for the Western.
There's mostly cheer and dance and
Sure.
basketball, soccer. However else, that baseball. And the.
Yeah.
It's a distance from each of us.
Oh, really? Okay.
Nearest other sports. So I don't want to.
It sounds like, you know, we're gonna go in Florida. It's a pretty happening area.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yes. Really.
Yeah. Hopefully you bought in before we traded. Yeah, we had a place in California outside.
I have like 3 slides and Bruce has like 3 slides.
We're already.
Want me to just get things
You know,
No, we were-
yeah, Eric is not on yet, but
After a few years,
Erica, the
I
presenter,
rented a place
she's not on yet, but
for less than.
Give her a few minutes to get here. I mean, we can start before she's on. I think Bruce told her like quarter of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get things started. We are at our final meeting for the academic. Welcome. The weather outside has been pretty much the same as it's been for a lot of our viewing events, and it's just as cloudy and just as rainy, much to our frustration. Hopefully this weather will change and we can get our scopes out under the stars a little bit.
We're getting most.
Yeah, it's been frustrating. But all the same, everybody welcome, especially those who are here for the first time and out on, in internet land. We have some very nice announcements to make, especially, about our scholarship fund. And if I could, Bruce, could you, speak a little bit about, who our recipients are this year?
Sure. So I think everyone knows this is the second year with a scholarship for 2 Westchester University students that are involved in STEM kind of careers and have some aspiration for astronomy, space, planetary sciences as a career. So we were successful because we were helping generosity and raising a little over $3,000. So we're able to give 2 $1,500 scholarships. The applicant period ended about 2 weeks ago, and we now know that the 2 winners were Reagan Steiner, who she's often here. She's an education major with a strong interest in astronomy, and she's the vice president of the astronomy club at Westchester University. So she's one recipient, and the other is a sophomore named Max Hutchinson, who is a physics major. He's doing some undergraduate research with one of the faculty, Mark Gagne. So I just found this out today. So basically, we're going to do what we did last year, where sometime in the summer, the two students will provide us with a bit of a bio sketch, their interests, their background, career aspirations, if they wish a photo, and we'll have them in one of the issues back, observation, probably in July or August. Just so you can put a name and a face to who's the recipients of the award.
So Bruce, how were they selected?
So there's an independent committee in the Earth Science Department.
Unfortunately, we have nothing to do.
Yeah, we have nothing to do with it's completely, and they basically take applicants from all majors. You could be anything that is STEM related and that has some focus in astronomy, space, or planetary science. Last year, one of the majors was a geology major, one of the recipients. So, and they review them on the basis mostly of merit, academic merit, and also need, and they select two. And so we're in good shape. And again, because of your help and generosity, we now have over $1,000 in the account for next year. So I mean, thinking positively, this is something we not only should continue, we maybe should increase if we can. But again, all is good, and just stay tuned for observations to see the bios on these two awardees. So good news.
And we can count on you to keep us informed as the year goes on towards our next reception.
Did you have a lot of applicants?
I think Karen Schwartz said they had about 16 in total. A lot of people applied that aren't relevant. I mean, if you're a literature major studying French philosophy or something, it's not really a good scholarship, right? So they filtered it down. There were 16 that really were appropriate, and they just selected the two that had the best GPAs, seem to have really sound career interests. Some of them were, again, doing either volunteer work or research work, and they made that selection. But again, as Dave said, completely independent from us, right? Completely on us.
Great. But again, Bruce, I'd like to thank you for not only just coming up with this idea, but seeing it through. I mean, this is our second year, and it's just been incredible. The response from our membership has been wonderful. Thanks again. So, great news. And Don, you had a couple of announcements, right?
I have two slides. Yeah. Let me bring them up. And then Bruce has two slides or so. This is from Mike Manningly. Let me change this to
He's our observing chair for those who don't know him yet.
These are upcoming events. So, of course, last Friday was BRC got clouded out. We couldn't go. So June 7th, and then there's an event at the Helicopter Museum where I think a lot of people helped last year. Family Festival. I guess we'll just have a table there. I'm not sure what the plan is for that. It's certainly not going to be nighttime observing at 10 to 3. It's 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. But maybe we'll have a table to hand stuff out, or have a solar scope set up. Could do that. I'm not sure what the plans are. I'm sure we'll hear from Mike about that. We've got plenty of time.
But are they also going to have us there later in the year for an actual nighttime session?
I'm not sure.
I think that's
I
in
think
the works
so, yeah.
with the helicopter
Yes.
museum.
And then July 5th is another Friday Night Right Play. And then a really good event is Friday Night Lights. I'm sure we'll be hearing from our contact guy Chestmont, who organizes this. It's a blast. We usually have like 40 scopes out there from 3 different clubs. It's exhausting because there's like 800 people come to this event. It's a concert. And behind the concert stage, we have telescopes set up in a long line. And it's a trip. It really is,
But the other nice thing about this is that it's not just our club, it's 2 other clubs at least, sometimes even more. And half of the fun is not just, getting a chance to run down and hear the bands that are playing and, taste the food that's being served. But it's also, working with the other club members to show the public the sky. And that interaction is something I really wish we could do more of. So if at all possible, you'll be sending out an email to us, we'll forward it to everybody. If you can save that date and you can make that one, it is worth it.
No, Hoops Park.
Hmm?
No.
No,
Hoops Park. We
no.
usually do Hoops.
The problem with Hoops Park is it's not a great location for this guy. And the last two times we set up events with Westchester Rec, they forgot about it and never advertised it. And we had like one person show up each night. They forgot about it. So we're sort of like done with them. I think it's like, yeah, they
We usually, I mean, it's been years.
yeah, we've been going there, and 2 years ago, Keith forgot about it, didn't advertise it. Last year,
County
the assistant
Medical Society.
forgot about it and never
Association.
advertised it. So I think we're done with them at this point. It's not a great location anyway, though. The sky is not very good, so we declined for at least this year, maybe next year. But there's other places that come up, like Battle of the Clouds is something new. West Goshen is new. So there's other people coming up that are actually interested in it.
We've
So
done West Goshen way in the past.
way in the past, yeah.
We did
So.
Hoops there,
Yeah.
we did another-
Yeah, so that's right out Paoli Pike. It's not that far. That should be quite, I think there might be a camping event going on that night. I forget, but anyway, so it's Friday Night Lights is a blast if you can make it. Yeah, West Goshen Park Star Party, and then another VRC. Star Farm, with a good weather, that's a great site. It's close to Westchester, but it's a really flat, low horizon, and they took trees down, so it's even better than it used to be. It's a really good location. We get a lot of people on a good night. We had like 50 people, 60
Yes.
people, so,
So we'll definitely need some scripts for that event.
yeah. And then, Mike listed all our camping trips. York County Star Party is gonna make them less than a month. And you don't have to stay overnight. It's only like an hour drive from Westchester. You can go for the night and come back. So, which is what I might do this year for the spring party. Green Bank Star Quest. I put this on your bucket list. Barb and I are going. It's an amazing place. It really is. It's a great event, 3-day event with lectures and radio telescope observing. It's a long ride, but it's worth it. We have 2 Cherry Springs State Park set up, and then the fall, York County. I plan to go to the fall York County. Anyway. That's nice to see the Pleiades rising late at night. It's a great place for that. So. And then one more slide and some shameless self-promotion here. Okay, so at the end of the month, on May 24th, I'm going to be the prime presenter for Astronomical League Live. This goes out to actually goes out globally, although it's mostly United States. So I'm going to do my Mount Palomar presentation, which I've already done on the Global Star Party in 2 pieces, but we're limited to 15 minutes on the Global Star Party. I've already done that. Truly is global. They have like 20,000 people watch that most nights. But so anyway, there's the link. I'll send a shameless self-promotion email out.
Well done, Doug.
But I am going to be on the Astronomical League Live. So if you want to, fortunately, if you throw tomatoes at the screen, they don't come through. So you won't get. But Scott Roberts, I met Scott Roberts at NEAT, and he's the president of Explorer Scientific. He's a really good friend of the Astronomical League. And of course, everyone knows David Leagley, right?
From Common Shoemaker League.
Thomas Shoemaker Leagley. He's an amazing character also. He'll be on. Those who are the co-hosts of Global Star Party, which has been canceled the next 2 weeks, but it'll be on again at the end of the month.
I like the also appeared,
What?
also appeared, David Levy.
Well, he takes second billing.
That's
Like
right.
a village is on that.
So anyway, so that's some shameless self-promotion there. So now we'll bring Bruce's up.
Is our speaker join yet?
Not yet. Okay. You can see what? Oh, leave the
So,
camera on.
Given that this is our last monthly meeting until fall, kind of just wanted to present to everyone what our speaker agenda is going to be for the next year. Now, again, people cancel, things happen, but, you know, in order to get good speakers and diverse speakers, you kind of have to do things well in advance. So I just wanted to kind of go over to you, for you, some of the topics we're going to cover over the next year from May to literally May of 25. So next slide. So for those of you who don't know, the goal always in arranging speakers, because we have a rather diverse club in terms of interests, backgrounds, and so forth, is to try to get speakers on a range of topics, okay? To try to tap into both local and regional talent, astronomers, planetary scientists, people in our own organization. We have 3 NASA ambassadors, okay? But also to tap into some national, even international talent, again, to address specific topics. So tonight, I'll introduce our speaker for tonight later. But starting in September, we're going to have John Conrad. Again, for many of you who've been here a while, he's a great speaker, NASA ambassador, worked in the aerospace industry for years, worked on missions in the 60s and 70s, and most of us have just, watched on TV, essentially. It's going to give us a little bit on kind of the commercial space industry, with a focus primarily on SpaceX, but, some other companies as well. That'll be our September talk. In October, we're going to have Scott Engels from Villanova. Again, if you've been around in that club for a while, Scott has been a longtime speaker. And actually, this particular topic, I think something like 8 or 9 years ago, before I even was a member, he gave an initial talk on it. And now he said, new data has come in from, a lot of observing and computational work that they've done, where he's really filling out this, this topic about looking at planets that circle M-class stars and their potential habitability. So he's going to share a lot of basically really new data with us.
Just to interrupt for a second. His first talk to us at the Chester County Astronomical Society was as a student.
Yeah.
Grad student.
And now he's like, what, associate professor?
He's an associate professor now. He's got kids, he's got a family. We've watched this guy kind of grow into his astronomy career, and he always has a soft spot for us and gives us he knocks it out of the park.
Yeah.
Speaks to us. Turn out to miss that.
And this talk will be that way because, again, it's going to build on work that he initially started 8 years ago and has now come to full fruition with a number of high-level publications. So cool. In November, we have Ravi Sheth from Astronomy and Astrophysics from Penn. Again, if some of you have been around a while, 4 or 5 years, Ravi gave us this amazing talk right around the time that gravitational waves were first discovered and characterized with the LIGO observatories. And I think he did a really good job of taking very complicated subject matter and making it not only informative but entertaining. So he was very happy to give a talk, and I have no idea the focus exactly of this, but the talk is entitled "Making Black Holes Out of What?" I'll leave it to your imagination, but again, he always gives a very engaging talk. So then,
hold on, Bruce, are we safe or should we turn out the lights?
what's that?
Should we turn down the lights?
We should turn out lights, yeah, really. Okay, go ahead, John. Done. Next slide.
Oh, yeah.
So in January, we kind of have a wealth of riches here. If you keep up with some of the current astronomy literature, one of the major topics in astronomy last year was the discovery of certain so-called universe-breaking galaxies. In other words, galaxies who are way too young, given what our current understanding of cosmology is, okay? Very controversial, still as yet unconfirmed. Well, we're very fortunate that one of the co-leads on that effort is Dr. Joel Elijah from Penn State. And so he's going to give a talk on this subject matter of early galaxy formation, universe-breaking galaxies and their implications. The reason we're having him later in the year is because, again, at the end of this year, there's going to be new data coming out that'll shed further light on this topic. So again, we're going to get cutting-edge stuff. Also in January, or we will reschedule, Dr. Eric Huff from JPL has agreed to give a talk on the Euclid Space Telescope mission that was launched last year. And again, the purpose of this mission was really to study the accelerated expansion of the universe and to shed some insights on the nature of dark energy and dark matter. So again, very, cutting edge topics. We'll have to figure out how we're going to schedule this. We may have an extra meeting, we may bump, whatever, but we have 2 speakers for January. Kind of continuing on the dark energy, dark matter field and all the intricacies of that. He's a really outstanding guy, Dr. Bhavnesh Jain at Penn, who's going to give us a talk in February on dark matter and dark energy, and again, their implications for our current understanding of cosmology. Again, if you look last year, one of the major advances in astronomy, or heralded advances, was the advances in neutrino astronomy. And we are really fortunate that we have someone in our own backyard, Dr. Naoki Kirahashi-Nielsen at Drexel, who is part of that team that is doing the work with the Ice Cube Observatory in Antarctica. So she is going to give a talk in advances in neutrino astronomy and how we're profiling the Milky Way through neutrino astronomy observation. Again, the talk is scheduled for this time precisely because early next year, there's going to be a whole new tranche of data that's going to come in that are, it's going to kind of further illuminate this subject. So we should be getting pretty cutting edge stuff. In April, we have a talk from Roger Kennedy, CCAS, a former solar astronomer. For those of you who don't know, Roger was going to give a talk this April, came down with some severe medical issues, and we, postponed his talk for obvious reasons. So next April, he will basically give us a talk on the sun. The latest and greatest on our understanding of the sun, with sure to be packed with a lot of really great photographs. Okay, he's a really engaging speaker, so that's April. And then we round out the topics in May with Julian DeWitt, who is from MIT. Again, he's published a lot of papers. He's developed new methods to look at exoplanets and specifically to look at the biosignatures or potential biosignatures in the atmospheres of those exoplanets to see whether they have any signs of habitability. So again, kind of very topical subject matter, a lot of controversy, a lot of interest in this. So that, there will be changes, obviously there always is. That kind of rounds out the field for the next year. And I hope this gives you like a little bit of variety and diversity in terms of the nature of the subject matter, the speakers, where they're from, and so forth. So that's where we are, and you'll get announcements about all of the topics.
And I don't want to steal Bruce's thunder, but as always, if you have subjects that you would like to hear about, or know some topics that you think that maybe we should be covering or getting lectures to address those, please see Bruce or myself, and we'll see what we can.
Right. And I actually just got notice from several people about some topics, and I'll work on later in 2025 and into 2026. So there will always be good subject matter to talk about.
But the other thing is that, we certainly love it when our own members present subjects. If you have something, if a pet project or something that you would like to present, either as a full program or as an introduction to one of the other speakers that we have, please let us know, because this is a club, this is us.
Yes.
And anybody who wants to, share their work in the night sky, hey, we want to hear it. So, all right, do we have our speaker?
Yes.
Yes, she is there.
Yes,
Okay,
it is.
Bruce, take it away.
So tonight I am introducing Dr. Erica Nesvold as our speaker. I think I had this right. Erica was supposed to speak to us, I believe, in November, and there was some family issues that we had to reschedule. So this is a different kind of talk, and I think one that's really intriguing. Erica has PhD in physics from the University of Maryland, and she has done a lot of computational astrophysics work at a number of institutions, including the Goddard Space Flight Center, the Carnegie Institution for Science, Ames, and also the SETI Institute. And she's now works as an astrophysical engineer on an educational astrophysics software program called Universe Sandbox. She founded or co-founded the Just Space Alliance, which is a nonprofit group that advocates for a more inclusive and ethical future in space. She's written a number of books, one of which is sort of the basis for this talk, Off-Earth Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space, which is a really good read, really intriguing, will make you think about things in a different way. And so this book, or some aspects of the topics covered in this book, I think will be the premise for tonight's talk. So Eric, it's a real pleasure to introduce you, and thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent, just making sure. Okay, let me just share my screen. And
That looks good.
skip over to my notes. All right, great. Thank you all so much for having me, and especially for being patient with me, as I did have to reschedule due to a death in the family last November, but I'm happy to have made it here with you virtually. And I'm glad that at least one of you have read and enjoyed my book. That's what I was invited to talk with you all about today. So as was mentioned, I am an astronomer, and so I usually like to start my talks on space ethics by explaining how you get from astronomy to space ethics. So people come to space ethics, which is a very newish field, from a lot of different directions. There's not actually that many astronomers in that field. Yeah, I started out as an astronomer. I did my PhD at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I got the fancy outfit. As he mentioned, I do a lot of computational astrophysics. Specifically, I was looking for exoplanets, planets around other stars, and I was doing it by looking at debris disks, which are the asteroid belts around other stars. I would model them because they're big and bright on the sky. We can look at the different sort of lumps and shapes in them and figure out where a planet might be stirring up that disk with its gravity. And so I learned how to do computational astrophysics, which turns out I really loved. And nowadays I do that same kind of work, except for a video game company, which is not the way I expected my path to go, but it's a dream job. It's just the kind of work I was doing before, except that many more people get to see the results of my work, and someone else does the graphics, and I don't have to write grant proposals. So highly recommend video games for astronomers for that reason. But along the way, I had the opportunity when I was a postdoc, so still working as a research scientist, to go out to Silicon Valley. So I'm based in Maryland, but I went out to Silicon Valley for about 6 weeks in summer of 2016 for a research program that NASA was doing. They still do it annually. This was the first year they did it, where it's called the NASA Frontier Development Lab. They bring together people in astronomy with people in big data, machine learning, et cetera, to solve big data problems in astronomy. That year, we were focused on planetary defense, which was a lot of fun for me, defending the Earth from asteroids. But because we were in Silicon Valley, and because the program was all about combining research scientists with the more Silicon Valley computational industry world, they made a point to introduce us to a lot of the private space industry people in Silicon Valley. And so since this was 2016, the big buzzword back then was asteroid mining. So there are a lot of space mining companies that have since been sold for parts, but that was the big thing that year. And I was really excited about that because I've always been very interested in human space settlement, not so much space mining, but a lot of people who are entrepreneurs in the private space industry these days talk about it as a path to human space settlement. So I was excited. But then the more I talked with these entrepreneurs, the more I felt a bit disappointed, because I would ask them questions about what I foresaw as being potentially big issues as we move forward into space. How are you going to protect your workers' labor rights if they're living and working off the planet? How are you going to avoid contaminating the lunar surface with your mining equipment if you try to mine the moon? And they didn't reject these questions. They just said, oh, well, we'll worry about that later, which didn't seem right to me. That seemed like a recipe for running into disaster at some point in the future. But I also recognized that I had sort of the same training and education that these guys did, right? Mostly STEM classes. I didn't have the kind of background that you need to think about these questions either. So when I got back to Maryland, I did what any good millennial does when they have a problem they're interested in, and I created a podcast. Podcasts are a lot of work, of course, but also a great way to trick fascinating people to talk to you on the record about their work. And so for each different episode of the podcast, it ran for 13 episodes. It was a mini series. I talked about a different issue in human rights or ethics that I could think of that we might encounter as we move civilization out beyond our planet. And in each of those episodes, I talked to several of the people who do have the kind of expertise you need to think about these things. So philosophers and ethicists, historians, especially colonial historians, who could say this is how it went in the past, sociologists and anthropologists, activists in various areas, medical doctors, engineers, also some scientists as well. And that was a lot of fun. This is still available for free online if you're interested, although this was back in 2017, 2018, so it's a little out of date now. And then I had the fantastic opportunity. I was invited to turn the podcast into a book, essentially. And so the book, which was introduced, thank you, is called Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. And it's more of an expansion of the podcast. It includes some stuff from the podcast, but it also includes some new interviews I did, updated research I did, and what was at the time the latest news in space settlement and the space industry. And it also asks sort of the broader questions, like, should we even be trying to settle space? If we should, why are we doing this? And how does the answer to that question affect the decisions that we'll make, the way we'll answer the rest of all these questions? And if we decide, okay, we're definitely going to settle space, how do we do it in a way that ensures that our future descendants, both in space and on Earth, are as happy as we can make them? And so my current mission these days is to try to get other people who are interested in space and technology to think about these social and ethical problems of space settlement, not just the technical problems or the financial problems, which is what the entrepreneurs tend to be focused on. As I was writing this, I was invited to co-edit another volume called Reclaiming Space, Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration. So this is an anthology. Different people contributed different chapters. I have a chapter in here about labor rights. The goal of it, as was conceived by Jamie Johnson Swartz, who is an actual philosophy professor who does space ethics, was to incorporate perspectives on space exploration that aren't usually heard in the big conversations. So while sure, they invited some scientists, including myself, to contribute to this volume, we also have artists and activists and philosophers, social scientists. There's a couple of science fiction writers, well-known science fiction writers who contributed chapters. And it just has some really fascinating perspectives. It's got 27 chapters from various people. And we're hoping someday, of course, to make another volume, a sequel volume, because that's what everybody always thinks. But mostly because I feel like even with the range of people we got to contribute, there's so many more voices out there that I think are really valuable. And then as I was working on this, obviously this kind of work put me in touch with a lot of other people, including other people who were starting to worry about various of these issues in space ethics. And so because of those connections, I ended up co-founding a nonprofit called the Just Space Alliance in 2018. And our mission is two-part. It's to advocate for a more inclusive and ethical future in space. And then the second part is to harness people's excitement for space, their love of space, to get them to learn more about human rights issues here on Earth and use that excitement and that radical thinking to potentially solve problems that we have here on Earth today instead of waiting to solve them in space. So I co-founded Just Space Alliance with another astronomer, Lucianne Walkowicz, who at the time was an astronomer at the Adler Planetarium and had been thinking about a lot of these same issues. So why do we care? Why do we need to worry about ethics in space at all? People who talk about space settlement, especially, advocates for space settlement, like to talk about space as a sort of blank slate where we can build these future utopias, these glistening cities in the sky. And indeed, right now, space does look pretty blank, right? The only things living on other planets from Earth are robots, and just get a lot of these desolate landscapes. It looks very much like a blank slate, but it's only going to be a blank slate until we get there, because inevitably we're going to bring all of our human problems, our vices, etc., with us as we come. And so really one of the goals of my work is just to identify what those vices are, extrapolate forward to think about how they might cause us problems, especially in the physical environment of space, and what we can learn from our past on Earth to, at the very least, avoid repeating exactly the same mistakes from the past in space. Maybe we can come up with some new mistakes to make this time. And so today I'm just going to talk about three major categories of these questions I ask about what problems we'll run into in space and what we can learn from the past about how to address them. So the first big category I'll talk about is the space environment. How are we going to live with this new environment? And in particular, how will we share it with each other? And how will we protect it from ourselves and protect it for future generations? So talking about space as an environment, especially an environment that needs protection, is kind of interesting because most of the time when people are thinking about environmental protection or conservation. They're picturing, Earth environments that are full of life and water. So the coral reefs and the rainforests, etc., where space looks very, very different. I get tired of just showing Martian and lunar landscapes. So on the left here is an image of Venus's surface from the Venera 13 lander, and on the right is an image of Titan's surface, one of my favorite moons from Huygens image. So yeah, most space mostly looks like a bunch of rocks, but why do we need to care about it as an environment? Well, for one thing, it was here long before we got there. So that's, I mean, like billions of years. So for one, well, millions of years in the solar system. So for one thing, it's worth just acknowledging that and respecting that. It's also full of extremely valuable resources that we could potentially use to construct what we need to live in space, and also just to make a lot of money from, which means that like most environments with valuable resources, it could potentially lead to a lot of conflict between humans. It's also really scientifically rich. Scientists love it as an environment, and scientists are just now starting to grapple with the fact that they're going to have to share it with people who aren't scientists and who don't really have the same motivations and cares about what to do with that environment. And most importantly, I think it's crucial to remember that we are capable of damaging this environment. It's hard to imagine that sometimes. It's hard to imagine damaging a bunch of rocks or empty space, but we are quite capable of it. It was once hard to imagine that we could damage the Earth's oceans or atmosphere because they're so vast, so much bigger than us. But we can already see in space environments like low Earth orbit, which is our closest space environment, that we're damaging that environment. And it's literally empty space. And yet, because of the way we're filling it with our technology and the debris from our technology, we risk making it unusable as an environment to us. And so that's an example right in our backyard. And inevitably we'll be capable of damaging surfaces of various moons and planets. And so that means we need to take the time to study the problem, to act deliberatively instead of just treating this like a gold rush. So how do we protect space? Well, this leads to almost always this inevitable question of, okay, well, who owns space? This is a question that comes up a lot in my work, and it is being really actively studied by space lawyers, certainly governments, and of course, private companies who are interested not necessarily in owning space, but in making sure that they can make money off of space if they're going to invest all this money in things like resource extraction and space mining. So if you're not familiar with it, I'll point you to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is our big international treaty about what we can and can't do in space. It's sort of a miraculous treaty, in my opinion, based on when it was signed, the height of the Cold War, and both the US and the Soviet Union signed onto it. And it says things like you can't put weapons of mass destruction like nuclear weapons in space, for example. You can't put military bases in space. And it also specifically says that nations cannot appropriate territory in space, which was really crucial at the time, of course. The US and the USSR were concerned about another one of these big colonial imperialist rushes that leads to proxy wars and such, and wars over territory. They wanted to avoid that, so they put this into place. And that's been great so far, but it's a little fuzzier on the idea of private ownership. Can a private individual or company own territory in space? It just doesn't say. Most people interpreting the treaty these days say, okay, based on the way we interpret the treaty, private individuals can't own territory in space either because they have to follow the laws of their nations according to the treaty, and the nations can't appropriate territory. But it's still fuzzy, and none of this has really been tested in court yet. But of course, it's still a really urgent concern for the space industry, especially space mining companies. And it's important for everyone because there's this potential for conflict in space if we end up trying to get a hold of resources that are only available in certain places. People like to talk about space as if it were infinite, but the valuable resources that we can actually reach are not infinite. They're very finite, and they tend to be localized in certain spots, which can certainly lead to conflict. So this leads us to questions like, what does property mean in space? So sure, maybe no one could plant a flag and say the moon is the 51st state, but could a mining company get up there and say, hey, this is where we're mining, no one else can mine here? Are we going to have conflicts over land use, and how are we going to settle those conflicts at the international level or at the local level on the surface of a planet or moon. Mostly what people are focused on today is the question, not so much of who owns the land, they're setting that aside and saying nobody can own the land, but who owns the resources that are extracted from that land. So this is the model that the US in particular is pushing for based on national laws that they've been passing. They're trying to set up a model that's very similar to international fishing in international waters. So you can't own the ocean, but if you take your fishing boat out, and you pull fish out of the ocean, you own those fish, and so then you can sell those fish. And this is the model they're going for in space. You can't own the moon, but if your mining company goes up and extracts resources from the moon, you can sell those resources. And so that is meant to encourage the growth of this capitalist space industry. And so far, that seems to be the direction we're heading, but honestly, who knows how it's going to end up. While we're worrying about all of these things and how to encourage industry and avoid wars over resources, we also, because this is an ethics talk, need to think about the ethics here. Ideas like environmental justice, which is about how you equitably distribute both the costs and benefits of using a specific environment like space. Oh dear. Hold on a second.
Can't hear you.
Still nothing?
No,
I can hear.
Gotcha.
You got me? I literally unplugged it and replugged it. Okay, sometimes that works.
Great solution.
Okay. I was talking about environmental justice, which is how do we equitably distribute both the costs and benefits of an environment like space. This is especially interesting in space because people tend to talk about the importance of space being for everyone. And yet at the moment, the model we're going for in space is sort of a very lightly regulated capitalist model, which on the one hand means that if you're the one investing into a space mining company, you're the one who gets the benefits out of that company. So that's the way that the costs and benefits are distributed. But if you look at the Outer Space Treaty, this is Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, it says that the use of outer space will be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development. Really what they're going for is pointing out that even countries who aren't yet spacefaring should be able to benefit from space. And that's not really the way it will turn out if we end up just with a pure capitalist model, because these resources are finite. So if we go with a gold rush model, where whoever gets there first gets to use it, then the countries and people who are farther behind technologically or in their ability to go and extract these resources, they're not going to get access to those benefits. We also need to think about intergenerational justice. So how are we leaving this environment behind for future generations? Are we going to use up all these finite resources and then they have nothing left? There's so many lessons here, of course, that we can learn from Earth in terms of how to conserve our resources over time, how to avoid polluting this environment with our waste, wilderness preservation. So maybe we want to have like parks on the moon or Mars that we preserve so that if these surfaces get really developed, people who are living there can still go and see what this environment looked like back when it was pristine and untouched. And even things like infrastructure development should be using some of the resources we extract to build infrastructure that future generations can benefit from. So these are all questions about what we owe to each other regarding the space environment, but we can also ask, do we need to protect the space environment for its own sake? And this is really, if we're getting into the philosophy version of this discussion, does a lifeless environment have some kind of intrinsic value? Usually when we're talking about what an environment deserves protection here on Earth, we're talking about the life or the ecosystem there that we're trying to protect. We don't really have any examples on Earth of an environment that we want to protect that we can extricate, that we can totally decouple from the life that's living there. And so this is a kind of a new experience for us to think about. Is there something about a bunch of rocks, this particular bunch of rocks on Mars, that deserves protection even if there's no life there? And this is a question that's still hotly debated amongst philosophers. I would say it's slightly in the minority. There's a group of philosophers who argue that an environment, not just any environment, but particular environments that are especially aesthetic or dynamic in space deserve protection for their own sake, regardless of whether any life or humans are benefiting from it. The majority of philosophers, I would say, argue more for an approach that says, well, no, life is the more important thing here. We need to figure out, what benefits life and humanity. But it's still hotly debated. And outside of academic philosophy, different cultures will give you different answers because different cultures have different understandings of what an environment means and what kind of identity and personhood it has, which is difficult for Westerners perhaps to think about. We're much more focused on this is a pile of rocks. How much value can I extract from it? But if we're talking about all of humanity's perspective on space, we have to consider those different cultures as well. And this sort of difference between cultures has resulted in some interesting legal structures on Earth. This is the Wanganui River. It's in New Zealand, and the local Maori people have always respected this river as a person, as a member of their family. And the New Zealand government codified this into their law in 2017 with a law that essentially gave legal personhood to the river, which means that anytime there's any kind of court case, for example, or new law being passed that would affect the river in some way. So maybe it's about fishing or water use or dumping of waste, etc. The river has appointed a human representative to speak for its rights in court, and its rights are legally recognized. And some people have suggested we should be doing the same kind of thing for the space environment. There was a group of lawyers and space researchers, mostly in Australia, who put forward this Declaration of the Rights of the Moon in 2021, which you can find online. This is not a legal document. It was more meant to be a conversation starter, but it lays out what they see as the intrinsic rights that the moon has that we should respect to not be damaged, for example, and to remain whole. Given how much potential money and profit there is in space, I'm a bit cynical about the success of this, but I do think it's interesting that New Zealand and a few other countries around the world have demonstrated how you can put this idea of legal personhood into their legal systems. Because I think even if you don't come from a culture or a philosophy that recognizes, say, a river or the moon as a person, this kind of law does tend to result in better environmental protection. So I think it's a good model for thinking about our environment. And of course, everything I just said assumes that the space environment is lifeless, but what if it's not? We don't know yet which parts of the solar system have life. We're pretty sure which parts don't. We are pretty confident at this point that the moon doesn't have any life and can't harbor any life. But we do, especially scientists, do worry about what we call planetary protection, which is preventing cross-contamination of life between environments through space. So we worry about forward contamination, which would be contaminating a space environment like Mars with Earth life, mostly microbial life, and also back contamination, which would be the contamination of Earth with space life microbes. This is something they worried about a little bit in the early days of human space travel. It's not something we've been concerned about for some time. Who knows, it may come up again. But for now, we're mostly focused on avoiding contaminating space environments with our life. And the main reason that scientists are worried about it is because they don't want some astrobiologists 50 years from now to be digging around in a crater on Mars, find life, and then realize that it's probably just terrestrial life that was carried to Mars on some spacecraft 50 years ago and has been hanging out there ever since. And so they're really interested in protecting the scientific integrity of this environment, keeping it pristine for the sake of study. And this is more and more of a concern these days because there are so many groups who are starting to send technology and someday perhaps even people into these environments. And it's unclear whether non-scientists are going to care about the idea of scientific integrity, especially since planetary protection requires time and effort and money. You have to sterilize your spacecraft depending on where they're going and whether they're going to land or not. And there have been space advocates who have said, the astrobiologists don't get to tell us what to do. So the astrobiologists are a little nervous about that. And then there's the question of, what if we find microbial life on Mars, for example? What do we do at that point? Do we need to keep doing planetary protection and make sure we don't accidentally drop some Earth microbes there? It's tough because on Earth, we tend to, when we're comparing the value of different forms of life, we tend to weigh humans and other animals much higher than microbes. It's how we can, bleach our bathrooms. But these hypothetical Martian microbes would be a little different, right? So Martian microbes would be the natives of that environment. We would literally be the alien invaders. Does that tip the scales philosophically or ethically somehow? Some people have, including Carl Sagan, have argued that if we find microbial life on Mars, we should leave Mars to the Martians, not go there anymore, leave them to their environment. Others have said, the astrobiologists don't get to tell us what to do. They're just microbes. Maybe study them for a little bit and cordon off an area for them to live in, and then, do whatever we wanted to do. This will be a bigger concern if we ever get to the point as a species where we're capable of terraforming another planet, changing its environment to make it more habitable for humans. Any planet we do that to is kind of by definition going to make it less habitable for whatever's already living there. That's a long way off in the future, but this kind of balancing of the value of different kinds of species, something we already do on Earth, and we might start running into this problem someday in space. So that was the first big topic, the environment. But of course, if people are living in space, then space will be full of people, and that'll bring its own problems. And so we have to think about what sort of problems have cropped up in small communities in dangerous, isolated environments here on Earth, and how can we think about what problems might crop up in space? So a big one that I personally find really fascinating is the idea of crime in space. What if we have a very small early space settlement and there's some sort of interpersonal crime, however the settlement defines that? Maybe it's just some sort of interpersonal violence, for example. Or what if there's an individual who's harming the community somehow? So maybe they are sabotaging the life support system, or they're refusing to work in a work shortage and it's threatening the crop harvest, for example. What is the settlement going to do about that? Are they going to try to follow the norms they brought from Earth and the legal system they brought and conduct some sort of trial? How do you conduct a fair trial in an extremely small community? Probably we're not going to bring any lawyers or judges along in the initial early days, and it'll be hard to say anyone's completely impartial if the community's small enough. And then the big question is, what happens if you get through the trial and somehow you decide that this person is guilty of breaking the law of the settlement? What do you do with them at that point? I was sort of startled to discover when I started talking and writing about this to the public that a lot of members of the public are really quick to suggest just throwing them out the airlock. And of course, this is because it's a trope. It's a very common trope in science fiction. And certainly it's a clean method of execution. It looks pretty cool, but I think even most people who make this joke would agree that we wouldn't want to apply capital punishment to every possible crime. That's terribly unethical and a good way to use up all of your space settlers. So what's the alternative? What do we do with someone who's broken the law in space? Well, after they make this joke, a lot of people, especially Americans, will default to the solution they're most familiar with here on Earth, which is to build a prison. But there are a number of both practical and ethical problems with the idea of building a prison in space. For one thing, you would have to build one. That's going to require resources, the labor to build a prison. Even if it's, using robots, those robots aren't going to be doing something more productive. And you need the physical space for it. So you got to fit it under one of your beautiful domes. You have to dig another tunnel for it underground. There is precedence for this on Earth. This sort of unexpected picture is an overhead picture of San Quentin State Prison in California. Famously, the first cell block of this prison was built by inmates who were waiting to live in the prison, who were living on a prison ship just off the coast. And so, this example has happened a number of times in various places through history. So are we going to end up where the first people found guilty of a crime are going to have to dig their own prison out of the Martian underground? Even once you build the prison, you have to maintain it. So that requires labor as well for guarding or for feeding your prisoners. You need resources, you need, food and water and air and heat, radiation protection. But also imprisoning one of your space settlers removes them from the labor pool. They're not going to be contributing their labor to your society, which might be living on the knife's edge of survival at that point. Unless, of course, you want to force them to work, which, brings with it a whole bunch of other practical and ethical problems. Speaking of ethical problems, space prisons have actually been proposed before. This is an image from a paper on a prison called ExoConfact, the Extraterrestrial Containment Facility, which was proposed by an astrobiologist named Charles Cockle, who has written a lot about liberty and dissent in space. He sort of designed a panopticon, if you're familiar with that idea, and he tried to make it humane, but the problem is that criminologists who study, and sociologists who study prisons here on Earth, good ones and bad ones, have all observed that prisons are just inherently violent spaces where, by definition, their ties to society are severed, and that causes a lot of problems. They tend to amplify existing inequalities in a society, depending on how fair your legal system is. And they tend to be really bad for mental health, which is interesting because living in space is already likely to, long-term, is already likely to cause a lot of strain to mental health. This is something that psychologists working for NASA, et cetera, are worried about already, is how long-term space travel will affect mental health. When you're in a really isolated environment, it's dark all the time. You can't go outside and take a walk in nature and feel fresh air on your face for years and years and years. There's always sort of physical discomfort and sort of a fear of something physically dangerous happening to you. So all of these things are already going to cause mental health issues with the residents, and then exacerbating all of those, the isolation, the fear, the discomfort for the imprisoned people will likely just exacerbate that kind of mental health strain. And these tend to add up to defeating the purpose of the prison in the first place. If you cut someone's ties to society and cause a lot of mental health issues, you're increasing your rates of recidivism. So it's a practical issue as well. So I think this is an interesting thing to think about because we don't have any prisons in space right now. And it's not clear to me yet that we will need them, at least in their early days, because prisons have not existed through all of human history. They're actually relatively recent invention along with police, and small communities throughout human history and even today find alternative ways to address harmful behavior within their community that don't require imprisoning someone. And so I think that this means that this is an interesting time to sort of decide, to study these alternatives and decide which of them might work in the early days of a space settlement so that we can put off this really difficult problem of space prisons for as long as possible and potentially just come up with a different system in general. And so if you're curious, there's a lot of examples of this that are being talked about and studied today, such as restorative justice, which is honestly a more complex system, but it's focused more on making the victims whole, making the community feel safe, and identifying the causes of the crime in the first place. Which isn't a specific recipe book for how to address the crime, which makes it harder to understand compared to airlocks or prisons. But I think they're kind of fascinating studies if you think about them in the context of a space settlement. So I've been talking about what happens if an individual harms another person or the society as a whole. We can also look the other way around and ask what happens if the community is harming individuals. So this could be a mining settlement that is exploiting its workers, or a settlement that has some sort of really oppressive local government that is oppressing and harming its residents. What do we do in that case? And the question, when you ask this question on Earth, usually what we see today, the way that people push back against that sort of harm is to dissent, to go on strike, to have a protest, to do, access the leadership through democracy if you can, and if not, dissent in nonviolent and violent ways. But all of these models that we've seen on Earth are going to be a lot harder in space just due to its physical environment. So for one thing, we're back on Mars now. These environments are extremely isolated, more isolated than that word possibly has any meaning on Earth, which means that you can't just quit your job and leave if you feel like you're being exploited. You can't say, this government is oppressing me, I'm going to leave, I'm going to become a refugee, I'm going to illegally cross the border. There's no border you can cross. You can't just walk away and live under a bridge or live in the wilderness, which means that everyone is much more vulnerable to whatever situation they are stuck in. There's also a concern, what if the life support has some sort of centralized control, which would mean that, for example, the mining employer has control of the life support, or the government that's oppressing everyone is the one who controls the flow of oxygen. This makes it a lot harder to dissent because if you're protesting against an oppressive government and the government has their button on the oxygen switch, they can put down the protest just by turning down the oxygen a bit, which just makes everything so much more difficult than the kind of descent that we're used to here on Earth, even in our most oppressive countries. We can learn about some very fascinating parallels to all of this from labor history, in particular here on Earth. So one big example is company towns. This is a picture of the Pullman Palace Cars Company, which made railroad cars back in the 1800s. It was one of these classic company towns. I learned about this in grade school. A company town is where everyone in the town works for the company. The company provides jobs, but also it provides all the housing. All the stores are company stores, so you buy your food from the company. They run the schools, which seems really efficient, but it also means that the workers don't have any alternatives when they're looking for goods and services. And the Pullman Company reduced wages in 1893 due to an economic downturn, but they didn't reduce rents. And the workers didn't have any alternative housing, and they went on strike. This is actually a picture of the strike of the strikers and the police officers lined up. The Transcontinental Railroad is another great example I used to use because that I like to use because people like to talk about space infrastructure as being like building a transcontinental railroad. It gets you to this remote environment and it encourages economic growth. But the workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad were working in extremely hazardous and dangerous and isolated conditions. In particular, there are a lot of Chinese laborers who worked on building the Transcontinental Railroad. They tended to come in with a lot of expertise in things like demolition. But of course, they weren't paid as well as their white counterparts. And some of them went on strike in 1867 out at a work site on the railroad. And while they did eventually get granted equal pay, the railroad company crushed the strike pretty easily just by cutting off their supply lines. No food deliveries, hard to keep your strike off. And again, you can imagine this could happen even faster if you wanted to shut down a strike by cutting off the water or the air. A more modern example that was brought to my attention by a labor rights activist is the fishing industry in Thailand. So this is happening today. Immigrant workers from Myanmar come to Thailand, sometimes illegally, sometimes not, to get work so that they can send money home to their families. These employers on the Thai fishing ships take their passports away, so they can't leave the country legally. And then they put them on these boats and take them out to sea for months, even years. And because they don't have any way to get off the boats, they are extremely vulnerable to abuse, physical abuse, exploitation. They can even, be dumped overboard and no one will ever know what happened to them. And the activist I talked to pointed out that you can, again, imagine this happening in space where the employer is the only one with access to the rocket that can take you back to Earth. And so you really are just stuck in whatever workplace environment you find yourself in. So given all these risks, especially risks from the physical environment of space, what can we do about it? Some people have suggested that we intentionally design aspects of liberty and dissent into the physical habitats as we build them. So Charles Cockle of the Space Prison has also suggested that we, for example, guarantee that every resident of a space habitat has access to an EVA suit, a spacesuit, and a rover, so that if they find their conditions intolerable, they can just put on the spacesuit, go outside, get in the rover, and I don't know, drive to the Canadian space settlement a few kilometers away. Other people have suggested making sure, for example, that your life support system is modular, not centralized. So everyone's controlling their own life support, so no one can control you by cutting off your air. And of course, we also need to make sure we're designing these ideas into our legal systems and into our cultural norms. If we make sure that as we're beginning the earliest days of space settlement now, that we're really valuing the importance of expressing dissent, of being able to leave a bad situation, of being able to collectively bargain, then those norms will carry on into space. Legally, I've heard people suggest maybe we should come up with some sort of space traveler's bill of rights that's codified into our international legal system, maybe with something like a right to return, which says that if you hire someone and take them into space, you have to guarantee a ticket back anytime they want it. If they quit, you take them back to Earth, which of course would be extremely expensive, but would mean that workers have that sort of protection from a bad scenario. So let's talk about all the things that could go wrong and making sure that we can live well with each other and with our environment. But for this last topic, I want to talk about how we make sure that people are living well in these space settlements and surviving and having healthy lives. So, of course, one big question having healthy lives. How do we make sure we are keeping people healthy in space? This is, of course, well studied by NASA right now, who worries about medical emergencies in space. It's something that they have a lot of doctors and physicians thinking about right now for astronauts who are living in space today. We can look to other examples of isolated environments here on Earth, things like expedition medicine or austere medicine, how they practice medicine in places like Antarctica. This is a photo of a Soviet doctor named Rogozov, who was a doctor, a physician, the only physician with the 6th Antarctic expedition, which overwintered there. So they were there in Antarctica for several months without the ability to leave, when he developed appendicitis. And what he's doing in this photo, which I have censored for you, is removing his own appendix using a local anesthetic and a couple of assistants who were literally just holding up mirrors. And so this is the kind of situation you can get into if you don't have not just the equipment and medication you need for treating medical emergencies, but the right expertise available. So sending only one doctor to a space settlement, maybe you're going to end up in a similar situation. And if we're thinking about long-term space settlements, we need to go beyond just thinking about medical emergencies. I mean, that one of the goals, really, if you think about it, of a permanent space settlement would be that you do have people dying in space after living a long, healthy life, dying naturally in space, which means we need to think about long-term geriatric care, palliative care, which is not something that's been thought about for the space environment. And of course, no matter how hard we plan, there's inevitably going to be times and emergencies or disasters where one or more of these important key components like medication and expertise is too scarce to handle whatever emergency we're experiencing, and we have to decide how we're going to approach those emergencies as well, which brings us to ideas like triage. So obviously, first thing, make sure you're cross-training, make sure you have multiple experts who can address any possible medical emergency. Figuring out which medication to bring is a really fascinating problem that NASA is working on. This is actually a picture of a kit used by Robert Falcon Scott in his Antarctic expedition in 1910, which I find really fascinating. You can also do things like screen your potential space travelers or space settlers for potential health issues. This is something NASA does today. They want to make sure that they're not sending someone to the space station who's going to have a predictable medical emergency that they won't be able to treat. And that's partly for practical reasons. They're trying to accomplish a mission. It's also just for ethical reasons. They don't want to kill their astronauts for something predictable. The problem with space settlement, though, and long-term space travel, is that in the long term, throughout the course of a person's life, everyone becomes ill or disabled at some point from illness, from accident, maybe because you were born with some kind of disability. And so we still need to figure out how to make sure we can treat chronic conditions, make sure we're building habitats that are accessible for people with disabilities in these really long-term settlements. And when it comes to triage, there's a lot we can learn from Earth. Of course, as I mentioned, there's austere medicine. We know about an expedition medicine. We know about triage in emergencies because we have well-established protocols in emergency rooms, natural disasters, mass shootings and such. That's been pretty well studied and developed over the years in our medical system today. But of course, there are also sort of longer, slower disasters, which we're all very familiar with, unfortunately, from the past years, like a pandemic, or in space, you could imagine something like a radiation leak that releases low-dose radiation over a long enough time that everyone's suddenly dealing with chronic conditions from that. If you end up with more patients who need treatment over a long period of time than you have equipment for, then you have to start making tough decisions. So, for example, this photo is showing ventilators lined up at the beginning of the pandemic, when we realized that ventilators could sometimes work as sort of a last-ditch attempt to save the life of the very sick, but we only had so many ventilators in a given hospital, and in places like New York that were hit extremely hard right at the beginning, they had to decide who to give the ventilators to. This came up later, of course, when they had the first batch of vaccines. They had to figure out who to give the vaccines to first. And so any sort of scenario like this, you have to ask questions like, should you give the life-saving treatment to the children, because we all value children's lives? Should you give it to the people who are most likely to survive? In a space settlement, you might wonder if you need to give the treatment to the people who run the life support system, or the people who grow the crops, or the people who can fly your spaceship, because without them, perhaps everybody will die. Should you give it to the healthcare providers to make sure that they can go on and save lives? So all of these questions are important, and all of them really reveal what it is that your society values. Is it that you value a certain type of person? Is that you value children and the future? Is that you value the survival of someone in the settlement above everything else? And so these are the kind of questions we'll have to keep developing, and they will reflect our motivations for going into space and the way we decide we want to live together. And then speaking of children, we need to think about the future generations in space. If we want to have permanent human settlements in space, that will, by definition, require us to be able to replace our own population besides just shipping more people from Earth. And so we need to think about what kind of ethical obligations we have towards our descendants in space. And that encompasses a few different things. For one thing, we actually don't know if it's even possible or safe for humans to reproduce in space. We don't know if it's possible to conceive. We don't know if it's possible to gestate a human long enough. We don't know if it's possible to deliver a human in space and then raise them and to be healthy adults. There's a lot of things about the space environment that are very harmful for adult human bodies, like radiation, like microgravity, and we just don't know what that's going to do to this very complicated process. And even more difficult, we don't actually know how to study this in an ethical way, because most people who do medical research and bioethicists will say it's extremely unethical to perform medical experiments on pregnant people and fetuses. And yet the first human who tries to have a baby in space is essentially going to be doing a really dangerous medical experiment. And so this is a sort of conundrum, both for the biologists and the medical doctors who are interested in these ideas, but also for the ethical framework as well. But let's say we figure it out and it turns out that we can have babies in space, whether through technology or naturally, then we start to worry about sort of larger issues of population control. What if you end up in a scenario in a space settlement where resources are very scarce? You have too many people, not enough air, not enough potatoes for all the mouths to feed. Are you going to want to figure out how the society can and the community will decide to limit your population? And there's a lot of, obviously, cautionary tales from Earth's history of efforts that governments took to control overpopulation here on Earth, and that can lead to a lot of sort of horrific things like forced sterilization, forced abortion, cutting off government services to large families and stigmatizing children who didn't ask to be born. They also, these sort of population control measures tend to slide into eugenics at some point, because you shift from oh, we're having too many babies to, oh, these particular kinds of people are having too many babies. And then that can lead to its own kind of abuses. And in space, we can also imagine a possible scenario where we're worried about underpopulation. If you don't have enough humans to do the work that needs to be done for the settlement to survive, you want to increase your birth rate. And how do you do that? This actually also has some historical parallels. In particular, one that's been well studied is in Europe after World War I. Places like France and Russia had just their population had really been decimated, and the government was trying to increase their birth rate. And that led to things like not just outlawing abortion, but also contraception, even education about how birth control works was being outlawed. And in space, you could imagine even more extreme measures of, required reproduction. Everyone has to contribute a number of reproductive attempts, regardless of whether you're interested in having children at all. And so all of these questions come down to the problem of balancing the needs of the community, perhaps even the survival of the community, against an individual's rights to their own bodily autonomy. And if we're talking about children in space, we need to think about their rights as well. It's possible, this comes up a lot in science fiction, it's speculated about in science fact as well, that it's possible that children who are born and raised in space won't be able to return to the Earth. When adult human astronauts return to Earth, especially when they've been in space for a long time in microgravity, they tend to be very weak. Their muscles can't support them until they get used to Earth gravity again. Their sense of balance needs to come back. And if you grew up in space, perhaps you never developed the bone density and the muscle strength that you need to be able to walk around in Earth's gravity, or even perhaps to be able to survive in Earth's gravity, which might mean that people born in space just can never come back to Earth. And that's kind of an interesting ethical question too. Is there something ethically wrong with deciding to raise children in space if it means they can't come back to the planet that their ancestors evolved on? Or maybe this isn't such a difficult ethical problem because you can also compare it to the decisions that are made by refugee families here on Earth. They have to decide that make the difficult decision to take their children on a very dangerous journey to a completely different place where they will be raised and perhaps never be able to go back to their home country again. And refugee parents have to make these decisions all the time. All parents have to make these decisions all the time about that will permanently affect their children's lives, and they can't consult their very young children. But it is something we need to think about for these generations as a whole. So I just spent 45 minutes listing a bunch of possible problems we could run into in space. I'll wrap up by talking about some ideas of what we can do about it, right? We can't guarantee that future descendants in space are going to have perfect lives, but there are some things we can do to try to avoid repeating the most obvious mistakes from our history. Number one, as I said at the beginning when I worked on the podcast, learn from the experts, not just the technologists and scientists who are working on space today, but the social scientists. So that includes people like philosophers and ethicists, historians, especially the ones who study migrations and colonies throughout history. Anthropologists and sociologists have so much to teach us about how humans live together in small groups, how they make decisions together. And lawyers and political scientists can teach us how all of these ethical ideas can get put into a legal system that can outlive all of us. Learning from history, of course, super important, as I think I've illustrated. We can learn more about how things like oppression, exploitation, injustice arise over time. Even if the first generation of space settlers are perfectly happy, future generations, you never know what's going to happen. We can also look at how the history of colonization in particular caused not only genocides amongst the native populations, but also just really catastrophic environmental damage that we're still living with today, and the way that land grabs and the way that colonization sort of gobbles up resources tends to increase inequality in society. But I think it's also important to look to history for success stories. How have human societies learned how to live within the limits of their environment in a healthy and sustainable way? How have we overcome periods of oppression and disaster? And how have we built systems to outlive us that perpetuate our values through future generations? I think it's actually really useful to learn from activists as well, and that's really of any particular cause, because like activists, we need to be able to both have a beautiful vision of a better world and also develop concrete plans to reach that vision. So activists can teach us a lot about the on-the-ground stuff like raising public awareness, lobbying for policy change, and in general, just being able to work for a goal that you might not see accomplished within your lifetime, which is obviously a big part of space settlement. We can also learn so much from marginalized communities, not just, I mean, this is important, but not just because, as we like to say, humanity's future in space belongs to everyone. And so just ethically, obviously, we should be getting as many voices in as possible, but also practically, we just have so much to learn from marginalized cultures and communities. And when I say we, I mean Westerners, and I'm usually talking about non-Western philosophies and worldviews. And this is especially true regarding the environment and how to live sustainably with an environment. And just in general, I like to tell people just keep having these conversations. People who like space like to imagine our future in space, and we're problem solvers. We like figuring out what problems we'll run into and figuring out how to fix them. And so we should use those skills to think about the ethical problems that we'll run into as well. And I think doing this kind of work, whether space settlement happens in my lifetime or not, just having these conversations and going through these thought experiments is useful to make sure that we're building a better world for our descendants, no matter where they end up living. And I'll just stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Erica, this is John Hepler. Hi. Not so much a question, just a observation as you were speaking and describing all of these conundrums. So many different books and movies ran through my mind. Everything from Outlander to Total Recall to one of my first books I ever read was Runaway Robot, and and so you're bringing all these things together into one conversation, which it seems almost so obvious, that we just have never thought about it in this location before. But all these existing problems and struggles that we've had to solve these things. Again, we'll just be repeating them somewhere else.
Yeah, I like
Maybe not.
I like well, hopefully not. I like to say that science fiction authors were the first space ethicists. They were doing space ethics before humans ever went into space, right? They were thinking about these problems. And generally, science fiction writers are using the space setting to as a parallel to Earth, right? They're using it to make some sort of commentary or criticism on the issues we face today, but it works just fine in reverse. We can use these ideas and these parallels with the issues we face today to imagine the issues that we'll face in space. And yeah, I'm a big science fiction fan myself, obviously, and I got to read a lot of more science fiction as people brought them up in conversation about a lot of these issues. So I could talk for another hour about science fiction as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think there was someone in the room.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is more of a, less than a philosophical question, more than a physical question. If we start mining the moon, you said one thing about do whatever we want to do. Or are we going to deplete the moon's mass enough to create an issue where the moon is going to be colliding with the Earth sooner than we think it is?
That's a great question. I have been asked that question before. People do ask that question of space mining companies as well. It's a question worth worrying about. However, the scale of it makes it not an issue. No, the answer is no, we're not going to do that. We'll run into a lot of other problems first. But this is exactly the kind of question you need to ask. You need to think about the types of inadvertent consequences that our mining efforts could have. So for example, is it going to kick up a lot of debris in orbit around the moon? Is it going to leave scars on the moon that we can see from Earth? Some space miners say, oh no, it's not going to be that big, but it's possible. We will run out of reachable resources on the moon and probably start wars over the last dregs of it long before we'll run out of the moon itself. It's too big. But good question.
Erica,
Yes.
my name's Bill Miller. I was the second person in the room, I think, who's read your book, and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It has a lot of great topics in your talk tonight as well. But what role does a centralized body like the United Nations or something of that nature potentially play in this in the future? Because it seems like no one country can really deal with this, and we need to bring some, unifying body to this whole topic.
So the UN has worked on some of this. They have a committee on the peaceful uses of outer space. That's the acronym is COPUS, and they do a lot of great work. But their work is as successful as any UN work is, which really depends on how much the superpowers of the world respect the boundaries that the UN wants to put into place, which is not a ton right now. Trying to comment on the international relations aspect of this is difficult for me, not just because I have no expertise in international relations at all, but also because through this work, I learned about international law and the fact that it's really literally just anarchy and countries do what they want to do. And which means, of course, that if we keep going with that particular system and countries do what they want to do, we're going to run into trouble pretty quickly. And this is actually something that space policy experts and space lawyers have told me, is that one of their concerns is that policy making at the national level, at the international level, is just naturally very slow and deliberative, and yet the rate at which we're doing things like launching satellites into low Earth orbit is vastly outpacing how fast policy can keep up with it. And so there are concerns that we'll end up with these big conflicts faster than we can get to it. Now, the policymakers are trying to keep up. The US, for example, is circulating the Artemis Accords, which you may have heard of, is not a treaty. It's not legally binding. It's more of a multilateral agreement, which means it's a bunch of like-minded countries getting together and saying, okay, we recognize the international space, the Outer Space Treaty doesn't completely tell us how to solve conflicts in space. Let's sit down and hammer that out. If I have a mining site here on the moon and you have a space telescope, a radio telescope up here, and my mining site is kicking up dust onto your space telescope, how do we address that? And so it's good that that's happening now. On the other hand, China doesn't want to sign the Artemis Accords because they're insulted that the US didn't consult them on. So all of this international politics is going to keep playing a role in the same way that it plays a major role in climate change. So my secret hope is that we figure out how to solve global problems through international law with climate change, and then we can apply those solutions to space.
I like your optimism.
But I don't know how to do it. So
Erica,
Yes.
I have a legal question here. Excellent presentation. I haven't read your book yet, but I looked it up to see if I can get it at the library and we're gonna get that this week. And I'm already imagining what I'm gonna be dreaming about tonight, thinking about all these ethical considerations and life in the future. But my question is specifically with respect to what you talked about just again, satellites and Earth's atmosphere and Earth orbit. And we know every country kind of is always populating more and more satellites are going up into the environment. From an ethical or from an environmental perspective, what is out there to kind of read and understand? Like, what are we doing to kind of control that? But we know half of the satellites are no longer active, and we're obviously not, cleaning up our atmosphere on Earth. Like, what is there to read about that, and what are we doing about that?
yeah, great question. The issue of space debris is, I think, one of our more urgent problems when it comes to ethics and justice in space. And it is something that space policy experts are really focused on right now. And even the space industry and the satellite industry are really concerned about. They recognize that they are potentially damaging this environment that their industry is based in. But at the same time, they're all motivated to extract as much value out of this environment as they can without being regulated. It's a tragedy of the commons. There have been several different groups working on this. As an astronomer, I've been working through, there were 2 workshops called SATCON, Satellite Constellations. I participated in SATCON 2. That's mostly astronomers focused on the issue of satellites because massive satellite constellations like Starlink, SpaceX's internet providing satellites, are really bad for astronomy. And so astronomers have been focused on them from that perspective. But if you just look up space debris, I think you'll find a number of experts talking about this from various directions. I've heard it referred to as our first big test of our ability to do space environmentalism, not just because it's happening now and right in our backyard, but because if we get it wrong, we could very well fill up low Earth orbit with so much debris that not only can we not use satellites anymore, which would be a disaster for our modern society, but it might make it too dangerous to move through that part of space in order to get to the rest of space. We might end up locking ourselves in, cutting ourselves off from the universe. And so there's a lot of people working on space debris from various angles. There's always people working on the technology. How can I build a little robot to grab the debris and deorbit it? Or like a big sticky net that catches the little fragments and brings it down. But at the same time, as always, there's a lot of social problems to solve. The financial question of who's going to pay for these little robots, who's liable for the space debris if you can't track whose spacecraft it came from. Are there non-regulatory financial incentives we can put into place to encourage people launching satellites to build in the extra fuel you need to deorbit them after a certain amount of time? So that is being worked on, but it's also a pretty urgent problem. Sounds like you ran out of questions right as my voice is running out, so good timing.
Thank you so much, Erica. This is
My pleasure.
really, really enjoyed your talk. I think we all did. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a great night. Bye.
Thank you, Erica.
Okay, that wraps it up for our academic year. Thank you all out there and here for attending. Hopefully we'll get a little break in the weather and we can actually dust off our telescopes and not have to carry umbrellas with us on our next observing sessions. I look forward to seeing each and every one of you, or as many as would like to come outside and get under the stars and get some starshine on our faces. So we just consult the website. We're keeping up to date on terms of when events are happening. As always, events crop up and get canceled, so pay close attention to which events are going and which events are going to be new, and we always need the help with that. So with that, get out under the stars and we'll convene here in September.